The Ukrainian fired upwards, the trigger pressed, unleashing everything he had against the Russian. Kiev's special forces needed to clear that building of enemy presence, but Moscow's men were making it difficult. A grenade came from the top of the stairs, rolling among the Ukrainians. The situation was getting more and more tense in the village, where soldiers from both armies had to face each other in high-risk confined environments. The Russian soldiers prepared the mortars to fire at the Ukrainians, who were detected moving through the open areas. The drone operators put their equipment in the air to assist their troops. The situation was not easy for either side. In some cases, Russians were surrounded in their hideouts, with the Ukrainians ready to throw their grenades inside. The Battle of Toretsk raged under Russian fire and the flights of Ukrainian drones. The fighting in the region had started since the capture of Orlivka by Russian separatist forces in 2014, but everything intensified 10 years later. In the middle of summer, the Russians decided to deploy more of their troops to take the city which once had coal mining industries, chemical coke production, ceramics, and phenol. Toretsk was in the Donetsk basin, a part of Ukrainian territory very rich in minerals. It was no coincidence that in 2024, the Russians intensified their advances in that region. In addition to strategic advantages, such as the railway network, that was where a large part of Ukraine's mineral reserves were located. During the month of August, Moscow's forces entered Pivinitin, initiating intense combat with Ukrainian troops. They desperately tried to protect the place. A tank from the 32nd Mechanized Brigade risked entering the village, firing at buildings where drones had identified the presence of Russian fighters. The cannon unleashed destruction. These blasts brought down houses. Sometimes they managed to turn the buildings into tombs for the Russians, but they were too spread out over there. There wasn't enough ammunition to take out all the invaders. The tank went through the streets of Pivinitin, firing at a point that caused parts of the city, already destroyed by the conflict, to collapse. The weaker structures collapsed with the shots, leaving only the skeletons of buildings damaged by so many bullets. The Russians ran between the houses, hiding until the tank's ammunition ran out. The armored vehicle left before it was hit by a drone. A BTR-3 from the 2nd Battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade entered Pivinitin. The armored vehicle's 30mm cannon swept the Russian positions with fire. It was hard to find cover after all. The shells went through the concrete easily. The high rate of fire filled the street where the Russians had advanced with dust. So many shots were fired. The debris from the destruction made the buildings and the Russians disappear. Breathing the air thick with concrete dust and gunpowder was difficult. The Russian drone pilots launched their kamikazes into the air to fight the Ukrainian armored vehicles. That annoying buzzing filled the skies, searching for million-dollar equipment. That annoying buzzing took a Ukrainian armored vehicle out of action. Another one was spotted in the same direction by the Russian observers. At that moment, an anti-tank guided missile team was already moving along the outskirts of Pivinitin. They set up an ambush, aiming their equipment at the road used by the enemies. The shot broke through the armor of the second Ukrainian vehicle with a guided missile. Some of those tanks managed to return. The Ukrainians had to be careful with those armored vehicles when they returned to their bases. They hid them as much as possible, even erasing parts of the tracks to reduce the chance of detection. But the Russians had very watchful eyes in the sky. The observer called in one of the Lancer drones, one of the highly efficient kamikaze drones that was launched directly at the Ukrainian base. The fire took over the building, making it impossible to save any equipment inside. The Russian cluster munitions scattered among the houses where there were still Ukrainian bases. The main casing opened, releasing dozens of submunitions. The explosions looked like a swarm of fire, searching for lives to devour among the houses. Part of that fire was aimed at the Ukrainian soldiers moving through the village. The assault squads had the mission to find the enemies hiding in places where the armored vehicles couldn't reach. It was dangerous work, full of bitter surprises from death. Russian movements were detected multiple times. The artillery did try to finish them off, but when it failed, it was up to the soldiers to search the houses, because the Russians were getting too close and in some cases surrounding some defenders. The Russians were already in the center of Pivinitin, about to surround the Ukrainians in their hideouts. The drones indicated the position for the assault team to approach slowly. They didn't want to take any risks. Even though there were two of them, there was a high chance that at least one would die in an attack against a defending enemy. They threw an absurd amount of explosives into the shelter. They ran and soon after felt the violence of the shockwave. Sick dust ministers. Shoulders from the warehouse, breathing on the little bridge. From Ukraine to Trust Granny Song. Employees, warehouse workers of Russian pants-painted Kashmir country. Ukrainian surveillance set the mortar sights on some of these places, but there weren't many alternatives for the Ukrainians. They had to send their soldiers into direct combat against the Russians. The waves of enemies were constant, always bringing more invaders into Pivinitin. The Loot Brigade sent a squad into the destroyed streets of the village. When they identified the presence of the Russians in one of the buildings, the shooting began. The soldiers' machine gun fired dozens of rounds in succession at those targets, which created an opening to get closer and throw grenades. The RPGs and anti-tank 4S fired their projectiles at the Russian positions, forcing the enemies to take cover. The Ukrainians took advantage of this to keep advancing. More shots were fired toward the thick smoke. The successive shots kept control over the windows to avoid surprises from a higher position. Bathrooms and basements were constant hiding places in the war. The grenade dropped to explode in a tight space, containing the energy of the blast and injuring anyone inside even more. The M249 light machine gun unleashed more fury to finish the job. The M249 released dozens of rounds, 5.56 rounds into the Russian position, causing damage to the bodies of the men in defensive positions. The grenades flew once again after the suppression. The operators of the Lyach Brigade were experienced. Many came from the local police. Paramilitary militias and volunteers from the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts remained loyal to Ukraine. They started with improvised military formations, which were later transformed in 2023 into special purpose units specialized in assault operations. Inside the enemy position, after they were taken down, there was no one left. They had fled from the back, leaving behind only the corpse of a man who didn't survive his injuries while trying to escape. The drones of the Lyut Brigade began pursuing those Russian squads. What the soldiers couldn't reach on the ground, they chased from the air. Grenades and rocket-propelled grenade projectiles fell, leaving bodies lying on the ground. The wounded tried to escape, destroying the cohesion of their advance. Fallen bodies burst with precise attacks. Not even the cover of the trees helped the Russians escape from the more experienced drone operators. Moscow's artillery was alert to the movement of Ukrainian soldiers between the houses. The D-30 howitzer was calibrated for one of the buildings, where the adversaries stopped to rest. Almost 15 kilometers away, the Russians still managed a precise hit right over the Ukrainians' heads. The kamikaze drones also showed up to finish the job that the artillery couldn't complete. The precise flights exploded. If the explosion itself didn't kill, the shrapnel and debris caused considerable damage to the soldiers inside. War had a few small determining factors in a soldier's life. The destruction left so many animals abandoned that dogs and cats searched for food anywhere they could. One of them sniffed out something where the Russians were hiding. Many times, the soldiers took in these animals and gave them food or kindly shelter in the middle of the explosions. In this case, the Russians chased the dog away from there. It was a big mistake because the Ukrainian drone noticed the marked position. It was hit by a kamikaze drone from the 32nd Brigade just a few minutes after the dog had left. The same drone operators saw the Russians moving to a hiding place. There were 3 or 4 of them, something common in the waves of advance by Moscow's forces. 2 soldiers were sent to try to solve the problem. An extremely risky order. At least the objective wasn't close combat. They threw a grenade into the confined space. The blast massacred the enemy flesh in the tight area. The explosives danced in the air, already thick with the previous blasts, judging the result still insufficient. One of the soldiers climbed onto the roof while the other guarded the only exit of the shelter, which had become a trap for the Russians. No one tried to escape the explosions. Still unsatisfied, the Ukrainians threw 2 more grenades to finish off anyone who was still alive inside. The drones of the 32nd Brigade were very active in Pivinitin. Another Russian hideout was detected. This one was blown up by a kamikaze drone. The Moscow squad decided to run out before the new strikes caught them by surprise. But the soldiers of the 32nd Brigade were already lying in wait. The rifle shots found the Russians' flesh. 2 fell to the gunfire, 1 slipped on the rubble, becoming a victim. Shortly after, the 4th managed to escape. The Russian drones were also ready to provide support to the soldiers. From their bases, the operators began to coordinate fire against these Ukrainians from Tokaya. The explosives dropped on the destroyed houses further broke the Ukrainian shelters. The Russians tried new pressure to finish off the Ukrainian special forces by hunting their men inside Pivinitin. The drone started to be prepared, propellers ready, camera cleaned, explosives selected. The operator attached the rocket-propelled grenade ammunition to the flying demon, making it ready to take lives. He and his companion walked along the tree line to the position for the start of the flight. The range of that type of drone wasn't that great, so they couldn't stay completely away from the combat zone like people far from the war imagined. The little monster flew toward the houses where the Ukrainians were hiding. It exploded over the building. The 2 S-1 Gvozdika also relied on the help of those drones. The self-propelled howitzer was a 122mm cannon mounted on the chassis of an MTLB-1. The loading was not automatic like in Soviet tanks. A crew member had to insert the shells for the shots to be fired. Each shot flew against the buildings in Pivnitin. Many were blown apart, collapsing under the pressure from the Russians. The Ukrainians also had their 2S Gvozdika, a legacy from the Soviet era. The Russians found one of these camouflaged on the outskirts of the city. It soon received a visit from a kamikaze drone. The blast damaged the equipment to the point where it couldn't move anymore. Afterwards, it was finished off by Russian artillery with a direct shot that landed on what was left of the weapon. These shots also rained down on the Ukrainian soldiers. The Russian attackers launched their assaults on the positions under the impact of drones and artillery. The soldiers moved through the areas cleared by the explosions, advancing deeper and deeper into what used to be Ukrainian territory. At that point, it was becoming increasingly certain that Pivinitin would fall, and the men from Kyiv still inside needed to be evacuated. The 3rd Separate Special Purpose Regiment was activated. They stormed one of the buildings, clearing access by force in a brief skirmish with the nearest Russians. The squad's designated marksmen took position in front of the window, eyes on the scope. The Russians began to approach, throwing themselves down, camouflaged in the vegetation. They were shot in the back. The shots came from above, piercing the men who tried to sneak along, hunched by the walls or the trees. The shots put 4 of them on the ground. The special forces ran to try to take control of the high positions in the buildings. The squads, well trained and used to dangerous missions, advanced through the corridors, relying on cover from their teammates. Climbing the stairs was very difficult. A rifle fired in automatic mode could take out several soldiers at once in a tight environment. The rifles pointed upward, while the men at the end of the line kept watch to avoid being surprised from behind. The tension built up. On every floor they had to check each room destroyed by the bombs. Sometimes they found nothing in some buildings and rushed to another. It felt like an anticlimax after so much preparation, but the tension returned every time they had to repeat the process and walk in the open field. Knowing there were Russians in the windows up above, one soldier opened the door, the other pointed inside. With the area clear, the others went in. This time the Russians were there, lying in wait. Kalashnikov shots came down the stairs, trying to find the Ukrainians. The soldiers from Kyiv aimed upward, taking position on the steps and in the hallway. The Russians kept shooting, unwilling to give up ground to the Ukrainians. Many of them had died to get there. Surrender was offered. When they refused, the shots from the Ukrainian rifles began to claim Russian lives. Closed. Hey. The Moscow soldiers threw a grenade. It exploded almost next to the Ukrainian, sending shrapnel flying and nearly deafening him. The fighting was very intense. The leader called for support over the radio. He wouldn't keep risking his soldiers against such an advantageous Russian position. The drone pilots identified the soldiers' positions in the building. With the windows destroyed, the drones were able to fly directly into the rooms where the Russians were taking shelter. The strikes began to claim the lives of the Russians. The flames grew inside the building. Some of the strikes were so violent that they threw the soldiers outside. The most desperate and confused by the concussion ended up falling. When everything became quieter, the Ukrainians approached the neighboring apartment and threw grenades. The bodies of some of the Russians were found on the ground, some with tourniquets to contain the wounds from the previous combat. Only one of them survived, surrendering to the special forces. The buildings in Pivinitin were full of Russians, so more special forces went into action. A tank and a light armored personnel carrier arrived to fire at the enemies. The soldiers got out with orders to spread out through the buildings. The squad started going up the stairs, some under fire. Sometimes you could see the tank shelling the enemies to give the soldiers time to get into position. The infantry transport also fought to drive the Russians out of the buildings, filling the air with dust from the concrete shattered by gunfire. The soldiers positioned themselves with drone support. The explosions coming through the window and the gunfire inside made the men from Moscow flee. By then, the Ukrainians were already watching at the windows. They unleashed everything they had against the Russians running down below. It was time to avenge their destroyed city, sending the souls of the invaders to forever haunt the ruins they claimed to have liberated. The drones kept breaking through the Russians' defenses. More of them died from the explosions in the buildings. Special Forces operators moved through the ruins, climbing more stairs. They threw grenades repeatedly upstairs, clearing the sectors of Russian lives. Sometimes they encountered enemies while moving. Their fingers stuck to the triggers, pressing as long as there were Russians standing. After Korn's confirmation, with the soulless body on the ground, they kept moving on. It was hard, exhausting work, firing inside the buildings, shooting ammo around every corner. Sometimes there was time to rest and drink water until the drones arrived and started taking out the Russians. After that, they went in to confirm the kills. The drones hunted the Russians throughout the area where they were flushed out by the soldiers. They exploded over hideouts or directly on the bodies of the enemies. Then, when the signal to retreat was given, some buildings were mined. These traps buried the Russians, bodies that would never be mourned by their relatives. Orders were given for the special forces to evacuate as the Russians began to target the men. The mortars were positioned to fall on the houses and streets. The team did the calculations and adjusted the position of the equipment. The inserted ammunition flew and landed right in the middle of the trees where Ukrainian soldiers were passing by. The tanks boldly moved along the edges. The automatic reloading system worked under the crew's watchful eyes. Shots started coming out of the cannon toward the houses, where there could still be Ukrainians hiding. Cluster munitions were the final blow to Pivinitin. The Ukrainians were in the final phase of evacuation when Russian squads entered the village en masse to clear the houses. In the western part of the city, closer to Toretsk, drones dropped grenades inside those buildings. The little resistance encountered was fought hard. The soldiers surrounded a Ukrainian in the ruins of a house. Grenades flew toward the man hiding. That wasn't all. A kamikaze flew toward him. Even with a Russian just a few meters away, the men from Moscow walked between the houses, firing shots into the buildings. The Russian flag was raised over the village after fierce fighting. The conflicts in the region had intensified starting in June 2024. With the capture of Chom at the end of that month, Chom was a village of 95 people before it fell. Pivinitin, on the other hand, had about 9,000 inhabitants before it became a pile of ruins. By the end of August 2024, the area was completely taken by the Russians, with a bridge formed in the direction of Toretsk. The war was not easy. To the uninitiated, it might seem like a glorious Russian victory and a brave Ukrainian defense in these almost 3 months of battle. The truth was that both sides sacrificed dozens of lives for almost 90 days for the sake of 2 villages with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. Not that the soldiers didn't deserve respect for their deeds, but many of them fell so that the Russians could advance 4 kilometers during these 3 months. Lives were sacrificed on both sides, with men marching over the bodies of their comrades to raise flags.